Morning, it's 11, so we might as well get going right on time. Thank you for joining, everybody. My name is Peter Cleary. I'm a principal here at Santis Health. Have been working on federal and pan-Canadian health policy for 4.5 years here at Santis, and previous in Health Canada in Ottawa, as well as in Health in Ontario. I'm joined by my excellent and incredibly smart colleagues, Stephanie Gower, who heads our GR work in Ontario and across Canada, as well as Chris Steer, who just joined our team. Actually, he's done a lot of work in the UK and Australia and healthcare and elsewhere. So looking forward to hearing from Chris today as well too. If you do not know who we are, and I think many of you on this webinar will, Santis is a healthcare consultancy. We focus solely on health and life sciences, on policy, communications, management consulting, and government relations. And we are thrilled to be able to speak about what just transpired over the last couple weeks or month and a half. We had a discussion prior to the election in terms of what we the tea leaves that we were reading, and now we're going to come back to that and see where things ended up. And where we sit right now is with the Liberals up 4 seats from Parliament's dissolution, 1 seat compared to the 2019 election result, and actually no change when you take into account that one of their elected candidates will be sitting as an independent. The Conservatives, relatively no change, same with the Bloc, the NDP, and Greens. We have the same composition of Parliament, but slightly different in terms of when you look below the high level numbers. There's a lot of speculation in terms of why Trudeau didn't get a majority, and we can talk about that today during the webinar and get the perspectives of my other colleagues. But the Prime Minister didn't appear to articulate exactly why we needed to go to an election. I remember the opening press conference when he was in front of the Governor General's residence saying, why shouldn't Canadians have a say? And I don't think that really cut it in terms of why they needed to go to an election. From the outside in, this minority government seemed like it was operating relatively well. There was political banter and statesmanship, as there generally is. But from the outside in, I don't think it was a government in crisis that needed an election in order to get a mandate. And especially because of COVID, parties seemingly were working together more than they otherwise would. The only thing I'd say, having worked in minority governments are tough to work in. It's tough to actually get stuff through. I think from the inside out, it was probably a much different story to tell. But at the end of the day, the Liberal Party and the Prime Minister, they clearly did not articulate that burning need for an election. And I think the Conservatives performed really well in the first 2 weeks, and the Liberals, having called the election, were on their back heel for the first couple of weeks. I think, and Stephanie will get into this a little bit as she talks through the Conservatives, at the same time that the Prime Minister had a trouble articulating why we should have an election, people had to vote anyway. And the Conservatives had their own hiccups that they had to deal with, and I'll leave that for Steph to comment on. But at the end of the day, healthcare continues to be a good issue for the Liberals. And every election campaign I've worked on, and thankfully I don't work on as many as I used to, because man, they're exhausting. And those who worked on these ones I know are still recovering. Healthcare is a good issue for the Liberals. If at the end of the day, the news stories at 6 p.m. are about healthcare, the Liberals are generally winning. If it's about affordability and the economy, the Conservatives are winning. And with that last week of the campaign being refocused around COVID because of what happened in Alberta and vaccine mandates, it was a very good public dynamic or a public issue for the Liberals to take hold of. And a really challenging one where the Conservatives had some inconsistencies. So at the end of the day, we had the same Parliament, but it looked a little bit different when you get a sense of the number of seats. There are more new NPs coming to Ottawa than the entire NDP caucus. there's a lot of new faces coming to Ottawa from all parties, but especially the Liberals and Conservatives. The Liberals made some inroads out west. They won back a couple seats that they had in 2015. There was a lot of changeover in Ontario. A lot of Conservative seats flipped Liberal and vice versa. Really interesting when you look at what ridings went what way. Leona Alstead, for instance, lost her riding. She won for the Liberals in 2015, flipped to the Conservatives, won it under the Conservative banner in 2019 and lost this last time. And in the same token, three relatively high profile in the regions, at least, cabinet ministers lost their seats. And that's in addition to Catherine McKenna, not running again. So there are 4 female cabinet ministers that the Liberals will have to find spots for in a new cabinet to maintain gender parity. So the minority itself is nimble that the Liberals have. Compared to Stephen Harper, you will recall when he had his minority government, he needed to rely on the Liberals abstaining, not being able to go to an election or to get things through. And the Liberals did abstain on a lot. The NDP were really smart in those times to say we're absolutely not supporting the government. The dynamics are different, and I would say they're not all that different than 2019. The Liberals will be able to operate on a vote-by-vote basis. They don't need a formal coalition. The Bloc can support some things. The NDP can support others. We have an interesting slide that kind of compares that, and Steph will walk through in a second. The one challenge the government has, and this has been true for some time, the Prime Minister's approval rating or the appeal towards him really hasn't been the same as it was since 2015. He wasn't particularly popular outside of kind of the vote that he got in 2019. And although his vote share increased ever so slightly, he still lost the popular vote, or the Liberals lost the popular vote. And the Liberal vote itself went down. So they will have their own internal reflections to make. How long does the Prime Minister remain Prime Minister? Does he lead the government into another election? Those are all questions they'll have to answer. For what it's worth, one, this is the party that Justin Trudeau made. The party was third in the House. They had next to no money. Their party apparatus was distraught when Trudeau took the helm of the Liberals. Not to discredit the work that Bob Rae did prior to that as interim leader to get them back on their feet. But I don't think there's an imminent threat within the party for the Prime Minister. I think it's more going to be a reflection of what does the Prime Minister want to do. And I don't think you should get your hopes up to find out what he wants to do in the next year or two. In order for him to have the moral authority to govern, he needs the other parties to know that he's willing to go to an election. That is a very important consideration for the context of any minority government. So if I were the Prime Minister, whether or not I was going to run or not, I would come out and say I was going to run. I would come out and say I'm boldly going to lead. Otherwise, you're going to have a really tricky spot where the opposition parties will be emboldened because you're too afraid to go to an election. And you can't have that for the Liberals to actually govern effectively. We'll go through some other things later, but why don't I pass it over, Steph, to you to start talking through the state of the Conservatives, and then Chris will walk through what the Liberal Party platform was and what we can expect from there.
Thanks, Peter. I think it's fair to say that the election results were not ones that the CPC were hoping for, and especially losing some long-standing seats in the GTA, such as Bob Soroya's seat, 2 others in Alberta, and I think that there's a judicial review actually going to be launched this week in Alberta as well for one of the seats. Compared to 2019, the CPC really dominated sort of in the areas outside of focusing on Alberta, outside of Calgary and Edmonton, when they captured sort of most of the ridings with, I think, vote shares exceeding 70–80%. And I think it's fair to say now that the CPC can no longer take sort of Alberta's right of center vote for granted. It was really interesting to also see sort of the very public endorsement from Brian Mulroney late in the campaign, which in my mind was, a calculated risk to capture the attention and votes of Quebec voters and sort of the Mulroney era Tories. But I guess my question is, at what cost to the other sort of right-leaning conservatives across the country? Voter turnout, was low, and everyone anticipated that because of the pandemic, but that traditionally does not support a strong sort of CPC push. But I think everyone is still asking what caused those voters to stay home, and did the People's Party of Canada fracture some of those votes? The next few weeks and several months will be really interesting to watch. O'Toole's team is already pushing out. I mean, they started with an article the day of the election, pushing out strong messaging to ward off a leadership review. I guess, sort of internal polling perhaps signaled that it wasn't going to be the result they hoped for. But we've seen a lot of sort of, in-party fighting already happening. Op-ed style endorsements from former Ontario Premier Mike Harris saying we need to stand behind O'Toole. They've even launched a website, I Stand With Aaron. So as caucus meets in the coming days, they only require 20% of the CPC elected MPs to vote in favor of a leadership review to trigger one. So it'll be really interesting to watch that unfold. And as well, the leader's office will start rolling out critic roles once cabinet is appointed, and it will be really interesting to see if those stronger CPC voices that we saw pre-leadership, even the Michelle Rempel-Garners, the Pierre Poilievres, if they're going to be back in sort of those traditional strong critic portfolios such as health and finance. It'll be really interesting to watch that all unfold. Next slide, Peter. So I think, as Peter and I chat with our clients and see sort of everything unfold after the election, there was a lot of speculation and discussion post-election for some reason that has focused on the NDP being stronger than how they went into the election. And I think it's fair to say that not much has changed. And Peter, feel free to comment on this as well. But I really don't see, too much change. They have only picked up one seat. And I think it's pretty telling that the NDP are conducting a review of their own national campaign to see what happened in terms of ground game. They spent a lot of money, 25 million to do this. And, they visited 51 of the Liberal held and Conservative ridings, and they've only increased their seat count by one. So I think it's fair to say Jagmeet is safe in his role as leader, but I don't think it's the result that they were hoping for, nor do I think it changes much in terms of governing. Obviously we saw sort of a lot happen with the Green Party in this election. Anna-May Paul has resigned as leader. Yesterday, the media was speculating that Elizabeth May would likely be coming in to take over as interim leader. The last sort of piece of the PPC and Maxime Bernier, they failed to secure a seat, although they did receive about 5% of the vote nationally. But I think that a lot of the traction that Bernier and his candidates gained was due to the anti-lockdown sentiments across Canada, especially in Western Canada. He held his last event in Saskatchewan. And so the evolution of that party and the sort of long-term presence, I think, remains to be seen. And what will be interesting to watch is sort of as we recover from the pandemic and move on, what does that party transition to secure votes, and if they will even remain in the next election. Peter, I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to add.
Yeah, on the NDP, I don't think in the last government, the NDP really were particularly bold or pushed the government to do things that they wanted, at least not in the manner that we would have seen in minority governments between 2004 and 2006 when Jack Layton was leader of the NDP. It doesn't have the feeling like they have been successful at getting things out of the government, despite the narrative around COVID supports and whatnot. Go back to the 2019 throne speech. The NDP campaigned on dental care, and they campaigned on dental care again now. And they voted for a throne speech that said that the Liberals would support a study at the parliamentary committee for national dental care, which for anybody on this call who understands parliamentary procedure, the standing committees have no authority whatsoever. It's a pretty easy throwaway. Like that is not a tangible commitment out of the government. So we will have to see how bold the NDP will want to be and what specific things they want the government to do to receive their support. But if they're operating like they did last Parliament, I don't think the Liberals will have much challenge there. And the only comment on the PBC 2019, it was a reflection of is this a one election show for the party, or are they here to stay? And the PPC has money in the bank. They have an office in Ottawa now. We just noticed. They certainly are leaving the impression that they will stay. It's whether or not they can keep or increase their vote share next election. So we will have a couple of years until we learn how they do. I think we're over to Chris, right?
Yep. All right. Thanks, Peter. So the next few slides are going to be quite text heavy. We wanted to just include a lot of the key commitments from the Liberal platform, but we will be sharing these slides afterwards. So I'm not going to go through everything in detail here, but we just want to emphasize some of the highlights. And if you do have any questions or want to follow up on some of the stuff we're talking about, feel free to add those in the chat. So just to kick off, obviously, number one priority for this government is the continuing response to COVID-19. The Prime Minister held his first press conference since the election on Monday and reiterated that this was his number one priority. He's talked about some of the actions he's going to be taking, including he's emphasised the government's policy for mandatory vaccines for all federal employees, and is really going to be pushing that out of the gate. Also, he's talking about vaccine requirements for commuters or transport in terms of planes and trains, and also the government's continuing work on a vaccine passport for international travel. Also, he's just emphasised the importance of providing federal funds to provinces to reimburse them for any funds they spent on implicating their own domestic vaccine passports within the various provinces. So they will be providing funding after that. A couple of other key points that are pretty important just in terms of where the government sees its priorities in responding to COVID. The Prime Minister has emphasised they will be introducing legislation to protect healthcare workers. Obviously, we've seen lots of protests across the country, both throughout the election and beforehand, including outside of hospitals. So that's become a key priority. And he's also, I think, and Steph may talk about this a bit more when we're talking about the federal-provincial relationship, but emphasise that he will be introducing paid sick leave for all federal employees, which it will potentially place some pressure on the provinces to follow suit in terms of introducing paid sick leave as well. On mental health, obviously, for the last 18 months, this has been a major issue throughout the pandemic. The government has emphasised this throughout and made some quite significant commitments in their election platform. The big one here we want to talk about is the new mental health transfer, $4.5 billion over 5 years. And in what will become a bit of a theme that we'll talk about a bit later, the Prime Minister has said that this will be tied to national standards that were announced in this year's budget. So in terms of that conditional funding, we're going to talk about that a bit more later. But the important point about this transfer is that it is financially back-ended. So as existing funding arrangements slowly pan out, this will ensure that there is no shortfall on existing funding arrangements as they expire. Peter, next slide, I think. So on primary care, this has become another major issue for the government. In 2019, they did make some commitments about access to a family doctor, but they were somewhat vague. So they've started to really put some numbers behind this. Obviously, you can see here huge emphasis on workforce and also expanding access to family doctors, primary care teams, using things like virtual technology. The $6 billion to support the elimination of waitlists That's quite a significant commitment, obviously, and ties in with a lot of the funding that the government's also bringing in terms of working with the provinces to reduce backlogs for things like surgeries and things like that. And another key area for the government, obviously, long-term care. Last 18 months has put a lot of pressure on the long-term care sector, and the Liberal platform is certainly building off this year's budget. One of the major announcements, actually, first major announcements that the Liberals released was the fact that the $3 billion over 5 years that they announced in this year's budget, they were actually committing to increasing that to $9 billion over the course of the next 5 years. Yet again, like the mental health transfer, this will be tied to the new national standards that they plan to bring in. We'll talk again a bit more about that, but again on Monday at his press conference, the Prime Minister emphasised he had no interest whatsoever in unconditional funding to the provinces. They are really going to ensure that they target the money where they see fit, and ensuring that they actually meet their election commitments. The other thing here is obviously the massive commitment in terms of workforce, which is going to build on some of the efforts that the provinces are already making in terms of shortages in PSWs and ensuring basic minimum wages that can be met across the country.
Chris, I might just jump in here for a second around
please.
the Safe Long-Term Care Act. So the Liberals in the campaign committed to a couple legislative frameworks, revisiting the Canada Health Act, specifically to make services like abortion mandatory. The only thing I would say about the Canada Health Act is that it's a bit of a Pandora's box. There are a lot of desired amendments to make to that act. It would be one, if I were in the office, I would be very nervous about getting into, because it's a very, especially in a minority parliament, I'm not sure how the Liberals, I mean, they can, but it'll be a tough world to navigate opposition parties, both the NDP, the Bloc Québécois, as well as the Senate, not just in terms of what should be a mandatory insurable service in Canada, but what the enforcement mechanisms are for that. That will be a very big conversation. And dovetailed to this is the Safe Long-Term Care Act. It will be interesting to see what the government thinks up in terms of what the federal government will enshrine into law, which is much more significant beyond just national standards. And we will have to see what the federal government can legitimately put in within their jurisdiction into federal law. I can speculate on that, and I'm sure many on this call will be interested in that, but I'm not sure the government probably knows exactly what they want to do there yet. And I think that will be a very big sticking point with provinces when you look at the federal government trying to create not just standards, but legislation. Sorry, Chris.
No, thanks, Peter. I think that's key in terms of that provincial relationship. We'll talk about that a bit more in a bit. The other area here is pharmacare and biomanufacturing. Pharmacare was one of those interesting commitments from 2019, from the 2019 Liberal platform, that kind of seemed to disappear over the last couple of years. It went on the back burner. There seemed to be less of a commitment from the government towards that. They've reiterated their interest in a national pharmacare plan, but it certainly hasn't been as high profile as some of the other areas we've just talked about. But one area that has got new emphasis is certainly life sciences research, really committing to domestic vaccine production, avoiding the kind of issues we've seen throughout the pandemic, where for the first year there was lots of concerns around whether Canada would have enough supply of vaccines to vaccinate its population quickly enough. Obviously, that sort of resolved itself, but now we're talking about taking advantage and avoiding that happening in the future. Just down the bottom there, just again emphasising that point, some of these actions from the 2019 platform are underway, but it will be interesting to see whether Liberals actually start to push these further, faster, or whether they will take a back seat to some of their other high-profile initiatives. This is just a bit of an overview here, and I'll talk a bit more in detail on the next slide about how this will all work. But as Peter said earlier, both the NDP and the Bloc have enough seats to hold the balance of power. So the Liberals actually only need one of those two parties to support legislation in terms of passing bills, getting legislation through Parliament. And for the last 2 years, they've been doing that on an issue-by-issue basis, rather than trying to negotiate any kind of broad agreement with either party. And we expect they will continue to do that throughout the next Parliament. Just on the next slide, Peter. So this slide, we're just trying to cover in terms of where there is agreement amongst the parties. And again, the Prime Minister on Monday emphasised there will, particularly in the healthcare space, there is a lot of agreement amongst the parties in terms of where investments are needed. Probably the biggest disagreement is how that should go about, or what are the major priorities. So just want to highlight some of the relationships that we'll see here. In terms of the NDP, the issue with the NDP and Liberals probably won't be a matter of what the Liberals are doing so much as whether they're doing enough of it. The NDP, as Peter said, may be looking at this term of Parliament to take stronger stands on some of these issues, and will be pushing the Liberals for more investment. Some of the things that they've put in their platform, universal pharmacare, dental care, they're still there. They will be pushing the Liberals to take more action in these spaces. But there is plenty of agreement in terms of need for mental health investment, and also on the national standards for long-term care. So the Liberals will be looking at the NDP to be their partner in that space. The Bloc, obviously the big issue with the Bloc is just about funding for Quebec. The Bloc, like a lot of the provinces, have been calling for more unconditional funding, so that will be a point of contention with the Liberal government, which, as I've said, shows no interest in any kind of unconditional funding, but there is lots of support there for workforce investment, rare drugs, etc., and obviously that domestic vaccine production that we've talked about. Now, the Conservatives, they aren't obviously natural allies of the Liberals, but there is agreement in terms of some of the healthcare space. It will be interesting to see how these debates move forward, but plenty of agreement that there needs to be domestic vaccine production and mental health investments, long-term care investments. These things are all in agreement. The issue is probably more around approach, how these things should actually be delivered. I think there might be some debates there, but the areas of agreement across here, the Liberals may look to move forward on those slightly faster, just because they'll be able to get them through Parliament a lot quicker. So expect to see some movement on this, and as the throne speech, as we start to see the throne speech come together over the next few weeks, whether any of these things are emphasised in order to get some quick wins on the board. Just to sort of wrap up on the Liberal Party platform here, obviously there's some major announcements. There's significant new funding, billions of dollars for mental health, for long-term care, primary care, and then obviously the big one, just getting us through this wave of the pandemic and out the other side. But there is still a lot to be done in order to deliver on some of these promises. The big thing there obviously is the negotiations with the provinces, which Steph will talk about in just a moment. But we do want to emphasise, despite the fact that it's a minority government, there is plenty of agreement on these healthcare priorities, and we do expect the government to be able to implement a lot of these things with the support of the parties, some of the opposition parties, particularly the NDP and the Bloc.
I might just say before we pass it to Steph, folks, there is a Q&A chat box that you can drop your questions into, and we will either respond in writing or verbally at the end. So you can drop those in as you go, or as we go rather. As Chris mentioned, we will circulate this slide deck and our presentation afterwards for further dissemination. And then we will also circulate a survey afterwards to get a sense of other things that we should be focusing on as well too. So Steph, I'll flip it over to you, and then we'll hit up some questions after we're done the presentation.
Thanks, Peter. So I think everyone on the line is interested in sort of the next step after the election and federal, provincial, territorial negotiations and sort of what the federal outcome means for the provinces. It's interesting to see that, with the exception of Premier Legault in Quebec endorsing O'Toole, all the premiers remained relatively quiet throughout the federal election. I would say keeping their powder somewhat dry for these important negotiations, such as, no strings attached Canada Health transfers that they've been signaling in the last few days. Ontario made it clear the day after the election that they wanted to make a deal with the feds on the childcare deal with the feds. I think it's an interesting move from Ford for proroguing the legislature until after the federal election, sort of signaling that the next legislative session in the lead up to the election will be focused on post-COVID recovery and, pending some of these really important discussions and negotiations. Just flagging for everyone on the line that the throne speech in Ontario has been confirmed for Monday, October 4th. So that's next Monday at 9 a.m. And that's the first day the legislature in Ontario resumes as well. So we'll see the tone that's set in that speech from the throne and how it sort of manages these early discussions and negotiations on some important pieces. Santis is obviously continuing to monitor and engage on the development of national long-term care standards. I just wanted to flag for everyone as well that the Health Standards Organization and the Long-Term Care Services Technical Committee recently extended their submission deadline to December 1st. So that process is ongoing, and obviously a key sort of piece for review from the provinces, going into the next year. Peter, next slide, please. I think, the discussion sort of that is being had right now is how it's perceived with what the Liberals want to achieve. So does it might seem dramatic or forceful from the PM and the media that they're forcing provinces sort of into terms on many of these programs. But really, a lot of these programs already exist in the provinces. So, whether that be the 6 million in addition to the, 6 billion in addition to the 4 billion in the budget to help provinces and territories clear the healthcare backlogs and wait lists caused by the pandemic, whether that be increases of wages to personal support workers in the long-term care sector and other sectors. Ontario already has a program that exists, whether it be the 4.5 billion to provinces and territories for delivery of mental health services. I think that there's sort of a lot of drama around this caused in the media as well to make it sound a lot more dramatic, but realistically these programs are already in place, and this is a lot of this is supplemental funding that the provinces need to continue programs that they might already have in place. I think that the discussion, the Prime Minister is meeting with Premier Kenney and Premier Moe today to discuss the urgent needs for both of those provinces. Everyone across the country is sort of watching what's going on in Alberta and Saskatchewan, and just how the political dynamic has changed for, I would say, Premier Kenney especially, appointing a new health minister last week, and sort of how does that change the dynamic between Alberta and the feds. That will be very interesting to watch today, what comes out of those conversations. As well, all eyes were on the Atlantic provinces following the Nova Scotia election, and the Conservatives picking up some important seats out there as well. How does that change the dynamic? These provinces generally rely heavily on federal funding, healthcare funding. So will the funding increase sort of cooperation on other pieces? We're obviously monitoring that as well. Peter, anything else you wanted to add on this?
No, I'm good. Thanks, Steph.
Thank you.
So let's go through a bit of the cadence of what to expect. So while we may not know exact dates, we can speculate, we can guess, but we know what order things have to happen, which helps you kind of predict what will happen next. So cabinet needs to come first. The Prime Minister made our speculation a little bit easier by saying it'll happen in October. And frankly, if he didn't appoint us cabinet in October, I think he would be open to a lot of criticism. I would expect that right before, right after Thanksgiving, probably right after. We'll see. And then the Parliament would be recalled by the end of October. The first thing that has to happen when Parliament is recalled is you need to elect a speaker. You can't actually have any parliamentary proceedings unless the speaker is in place. So that is a vote process. It could take a day. It could take 2 days. If they're really focused, they can get it all done in a day. And we will see who puts their names forward. Oftentimes, especially in a minority context, it is a Liberal that would end up winning that seat. It takes one more seat away from the Liberals, and the opposition want to maximize the number of votes that they have. Following the selection of the speaker, the first thing that we will hear is the speech from the throne. The only thing I would flag here is that the government usually likes to send a message in terms of what's priority for them. So on the notice paper, so on the orders of the day where they put on notice what bills they want to table, they would put on notice likely a couple bills that they think are most important. So the earliest opportunity that you can see that notice paper, it will give you a sense of what they're up to. I would suspect there would probably be a bill on financial measures relating to COVID from Chrystia Freeland to get that money for surgical backlog. So if you go to the Liberal Party platform, you take a look at their cost of platform and money, the new money they want to flow this fiscal year, you would expect a bill to be tabled pretty darn quickly to get that money flowing. After the speech from the throne, there's the first confidence vote. I don't think anybody will expect the Liberals to lose that vote, though I think it will be interesting to see what's in the speech from the throne as the Liberals consult with opposition parties to get language in there that appeal to both, well, all three, the Conservative, the Bloc, and the NDP. Mandate letters, I know there will be a lot of people wondering when mandate letters will come out, because the speech from the throne is that high level, where's the government going to go? I don't think you'll see anything spectacularly new, except for what they perhaps start prioritizing and what tidbits they give to the opposition. The mandate letters will give us a better sense of a more detailed look at ministry or department by department, ministry by ministry, what the focus will be. If they're similar to the last round of mandate letters from the last government, expect them to be long. I have a bit of a criticism for that. I think they, not to sound like Stéphane Dion, it sounds like they had too many priorities, and then they were thrown aside by COVID. I think Maclean's did an analysis, and they can reasonably claim to get done about 10% of what they committed to do in 2019. But either way, we'll get a sense of that prioritization. They take a lot longer. The mandate letters take a lot longer to get out there than I think we as the stakeholder community would like. They could come as late as January. I would hope they come before that, especially if the government wants to be viewed as strongly moving forward, an aggressive pace, taking this mandate seriously, that they would get those going forward. And they actually have enough time this fall to have a strong legislative session as well too. Look to see what sort of pieces of legislation they want to push through. We'll talk to that on the last slide. The other question folks on this call might have is, when do the pre-budget submission process, when will that be picked back up again by the Finance Standing Committee? Many here probably put a submission forward to that. Committees still need to be negotiated. It's a new parliament. And there's always a debate that parties have in terms of what the composition of those committees will be. How many seats in a minority context do each party have on there? What party gets to have a role of chair? That could take a long time. It could take no time at all. In 2019, you'll recall it took a lot longer, but they did constitute the Finance Committee pretty quickly to get the pre-budget submission process going. And then all eyes towards budget 2022. So whether or not the Minister of Finance, Chrystia Freeland, does that early bill as a for immediate investments as a one-off bill or a fall economic statement, to be determined, but you can expect that budget. I think February is too early, but we're giving ourselves a buffer room because it's all speculation, but somewhere between February and May, you'll see a federal budget that lays out the spending priorities based on the Liberals platform. I think I covered this off, other than to highlight again that there will be there's going to be a very different cabinet, I would suspect. Somebody asked in the question, will the Minister of Health change? I'd suspect so. I very much wouldn't be surprised if they changed the focus for a healthcare recovery and rejigged who is in cabinet. And I think, because they have so many people to bring in, it will be a lot easier to change the existing portfolios. Again, they've lost 4 females from the existing cabinet, and one would expect this government to maintain gender parity. They have many new elected members who are well suited for cabinet, and there is going to be some consternation among the backbench of individuals who would like to be elevated, let alone the competition for parliamentary secretaries, which will follow shortly thereafter. And I think I spoke to the speech from the throne. Steph or Chris, anything to add on all of those next steps?
Not on my end.
Cool. So I'll quickly run through this, and then we'll have a quick chat, and folks can speak to the questions that kind of come in the window. There's a lot of work that has yet to be done. And Steph mentioned this when it came to childcare. I was talking about the legislative agenda. They'll pick back up conversion therapy that didn't pass the Senate before Parliament dissolved. There's a lot of work that needs to be done on clean drinking water, commitments that weren't met, Indigenous reconciliation, especially with the news, the very tragic and sad news over the summer. I mean, it might be out of the front pages, but with Truth and Reconciliation Day tomorrow, I think there will be a very earnest reflection on what more the government needs to do. Pharmacare is one that that interestingly had more play in this election than it did in 2011. But the Liberals had that deal with PEI to increase level of support for the drug program, and how they proceed and what sort of funding they want to put in place for other provinces will be interesting. As you're looking at these priorities, especially at the platform, the ones that have financial commitments are the ones they're taking seriously. And Pharmacare, as of yet, does not have a financial commitment assigned to it. And I don't think we will learn if they have that until the next budget. But there's still a lot of work behind the scenes. With the Liberals still in place, the Canada Drug Agency will move forward in some fashion. I think if the Conservatives got in, that would be done. CADF is doing a consultation this fall, likely. Maybe it'll bleed into the winter because of the election, but on a national formulary, something that's been in the Liberals' mandate letter since 2015 when I was there. And you also have rare drugs. The government, the bureaucracy was doing a more stakeholder to stakeholder consultation before the election that was cut short because of the election. Expect a draft strategy to come out, and they need to figure out how they're going to spend $500 million a year. Future news, it'll probably all go to the provinces. There is a ongoing need to support provinces, especially Alberta and Saskatchewan, for COVID-19. Surgical wait times will need to be addressed, and backlogs will be addressed. Federal support to transfer patients is on the table right now. That is going to be a major priority. On the international relations front, it's going to start taking a lot of the government's capacity. I'm already hearing about conferences the government is trying to figure out how to get to in the next couple of weeks. Afghanistan may or may not be a big topic. It really was the first 2 weeks of the campaign, but it seems to have subsided slightly. Relations with China, especially as the US looks to reset and the two Michaels come home, that will be a topic of conversation. You will have a premiers conference at one point, and likely the Prime Minister will want to meet with the premiers at one point. But in addition to that, you have your international summits with the G20, with climate summits, with trying to figure out how to reopen the US borders in an equivalent manner. So that way it's not just Canada opening the US, but also the other way around. And then as Steph highlighted, a lot of those FPT relationships. Steph, Chris, any sort of thoughts here that you wanted to highlight?
I think the point with this slide is just that there are so many competing priorities and pieces that weren't even touched during the federal election I really was disappointed to see that not a lot of time was spent during the debates or just in the sort of national dialogue on any of the Indigenous reconciliation pieces. I think a lot of Canadians were looking for that. So it'll be really interesting to see sort of how the dialogue continues in Parliament on this. Strong opposition, opposition, needs to be strong on these matters to push them forward. But there's also just so much on the international relations piece, and we've only highlighted a few things here that are going to preoccupy sort of the government's attention. So there's a lot going on right now, and it will be very, very interesting to see how, from my perspective, the opposition holds the government to account on a lot of these pieces. Chris, anything that you want to add?
Yeah, I think just to build on that, there's sort of expectation setting here as well in terms of time. I mean, it's the end of September, as Peter said, we'll laid out on the last slide. We have a bit of an idea of what that schedule looks like. But for the rest of the year, there is a lot in terms of what the government already has to deal with, as well as their priorities. So some of those big health commitments we were just talking about, in terms of timelines for that, we are definitely not talking about this year in terms of major movement on a lot of these things. So just worth keeping in mind that other things will be dominating the agenda, but the healthcare agenda will likely come back up as we get into pre-budget submissions and budget next year as well.
Thanks, Chris. Why don't we tackle a couple of the questions? I can probably take the first one, Steph the second, and then any one of us the third. On PMPRB, the gosh darn PMPRB, the never-ending file. So my sense of that right now is 5 years in the making, 3 delays. The writing is on the wall that the government has delayed before and they may delay again. I think there will likely be a serious reflection about how committed the government is to this file. It will be interesting if there are any dynamics around the file that might change with the new health minister. But I would add this to the list of, and I'm sorry I didn't have it in the slide that's up on the screen now in terms of unfinished business. This is definitely a file that the government has committed and recommitted itself to over the past 5 years, but just haven't moved forward to it, whether it's impacts to the industry while the government is trying to focus on COVID and procure vaccines, whether or not it's the right actual approach from a policy framework, and I'm setting the cost savings aside in terms of how they're trying to get the cost savings, if it actually makes sense. I think there's a lot of polar opposite views on this file, which from a government perspective is a file you generally want to stay clear of, and this one has definitely developed polar opposites. So I see the government losing if they don't move ahead with it, because the NDP will not be very kind to them on that, and the NDP have consistently pushed them to do it. And at the same time, if they do move ahead with it, the Bloc Québécois would be very upset with the government, let alone the stakeholder environment as well as this too. So this is a file that started in 2015, 2016. And I think it's a file that is for some in government and probably in central agencies is a bit of a headache, because 5-6 years later, they have to deal with it. And I suspect they just want it to go away. Whether that means it goes forward or it doesn't go forward, I think there's a lot of people in government that just would want it to be put to bed. Steph, do you want to take the Bill 124 question?
Yeah, so the question is the salary increase for PSWs by the Liberals. Will that be an issue, or will be an issue in Ontario because of Bill 124? Sort of thoughts on that. And just for everyone, a reminder, Bill 124 sets limits on compensation increases, salaries, pensions, benefits, and a 1% increase for that three-year period. So yeah, I mean, I think certainly it's going to be a difficult discussion, Deborah, to have between the feds and the province on this one. I do think that there, is probably in the next year, just in the lead up to the election, the Ontario government knows that they have to have this difficult discussion. And I think that we'll probably be seeing more on this in the next, I would say, few months. Just let's see how the throne speech goes on Monday, how they signal the relationship with the federal government, if this is a priority for them, will it be in there? See what's going on in the fall economic statement again this year. But it is a very challenging, I would say, issue, especially in Ontario, to deal with. But let's see what the tone the Premier sets in the next few weeks. I think as these issues are still top of mind, for a lot of Ontarians and Canadians, but a lot of Ontarians, as we're still in the midst of this pandemic.
Yeah, I think the only thing I could add on this one, Steph, is with federal funding in the window, I'm curious to see if and how Ontario will change tact. It would be tough for them from an optics standpoint to reverse, but they're going into an election and they need to start thinking about populist policies that will win. And I don't think Bill 124 is going to do them any favors. You don't want healthcare workers protesting during a pandemic and in the lead up to an election. So I think there is a lot of there are some decisions the Ford government will have to make on this as they think about their approach to constraining wage increases, while the federal government at the same time is literally giving them a check to do exactly that. So I think Deborah, you ask a really good question. I think what you're hearing from Steph and I is that we don't actually have a direct answer. All we have is a couple things they may want to consider in the year of an election. On timelines for the milestones, I think I addressed that in the last slide, but I would expect the speech from the throne and votes to be wrapped up on that early October. Mandate letters, early November, not early October. Mandate letters could come as soon as end of November or as late as January. The one thing that I would say is, the government will likely highlight, it will give you a sense of what the government's really truly prioritizing from their platform based on what gets in the mandate letter. So from an advocacy standpoint, you want to make sure that what you care about that is in the platform is indeed included in the mandate letter so that the minister has direction to move forward on it. The only caveat to that is I have many times seen platform items not make it into the mandate letter and move forward, or items that were not on the platform make it into the mandate letter. And then the third category is things that were in neither still move forward with effective advocacy campaigns. So there is no clear and cut answer other than putting forth an argument to the government that aligns with what they're trying to achieve. So whatever you are advocating for, you make sure that it fits within the thematic approach of the throne speech, of the mandate letters, and of the platform, in order to articulate why you want the government to do exactly what you're asking them to do. I don't know if Steph, Chris, you guys want to kind of comment on that as we bridge from timelines to effective advocacy.
I'm okay, but I can look at the next one, Peter.
Sure.
So just in terms of Roberta's question about COVID response and also just a retrospective look at how Canada dealt with it, I think obviously the priority right now is this fourth wave, getting through COVID in the first place. Given the fact that it is a minority government, you should expect to see that over the next couple of years there will be more pressure, particularly from the opposition parties, for a full and comprehensive investigation and look back. What form that will take will really change the impact it has. So if it's done at a parliamentary committee level, as Peter sort of mentioned earlier, those parliamentary committees, the reports aren't as significant sometimes, but if it does take on a bigger form, even something as large as a Royal Commission, the size and scope in terms of the impact, looking back, a backwards look at what worked well, what didn't work well, particularly the early lessons from the pandemic, I think that could have more of a profound impact over the next few years. But I would be very surprised if there was significant movement on this in the next year or so.
Chris, the only amendment I would make to that is that we're in a minority context, and in a minority parliament, committees are all powerful. Government doesn't control the agenda of committees. The opposition party does, frankly. Opposition parties do, frankly. And committees are able to demand any documents from government. A lot of the time, you saw this in the last parliament. A lot of them, the government may wish to have redacted, and the opposition parties say no. You'll remember the head of the public health agency was called to the bar, called to parliament to be scolded for not complying with a committee request for documentation around, I believe it was the research center in Winnipeg. But you will see, I think, a big push from opposition parties to leverage the authority and the power that committees hold in this context. And that will be problematic for the Liberals. So the Liberals need to figure out how do they constitute committees or a committee in a manner that gives some sense of reasonableness to it. Otherwise, the committee is going to be used to wear the Liberals down and take capacity and resources from them so that the Liberals aren't able to actually do their day-to-day job of governing. And that is what the opposition parties will be focused on. And they will need to do so in a way where they don't look ridiculous to the public. Steph, do you want to take the next one?
Sorry,
How will the government respond to premiers demanding long-term unconditional health transfers, in our opinion?
Thanks, Peter. Sorry, I was just pulling up the question.
No, all good, don't worry.
So I think it's an interesting dynamic to see sort of on that piece. In Ontario specifically, prior to the election, Premier Ford, was very focused and always made it very public how strong his relationship was with the Deputy Prime Minister, and sort of a very collaborative relationship to get the province through the worst of the pandemic and ensuring that Ontarians had the sort of financial supports they needed and whatever else the province needed. I think, to the slide we had on the FPT sort of negotiations piece, will the premiers being sort of silent throughout the election, how does that mean? What does that mean going forward for sort of the discussion? And will the premiers, I think, as Peter pointed out, in their next meeting with the Prime Minister, how will that meeting go, and how will the premiers come together to sort of negotiate key pieces that are key in all of the provinces? But from a minority government perspective, not much has changed. So I think you'll still see the standard sort of push and fair share arguments being made from each province as it was prior to the election.
Thanks, Steph. On the question of health human resources, the increase of wages to the PSWs and how it might impact nurses, if I were advising government, I would probably have two comments. One, PSWs have and continue to be underpaid. However, when you make a change in one aspect of HHR, it will have a domino effect for the others. And I think the government federally, if they're going to play in the HHR sandbox, they need to do so in a holistic manner. And figure out what the right funding mix and supports are needed from provinces. I think it's clear there's burnout in many health professions across the board, across provinces, in addition to systemic issues as it relates to some of these specific professions. And the only way to do that is by looking at them as a whole. And I hope the federal government does do that. If they're going to start transferring money to specific professions, with the caveat that I think there are some of the professions that have more systemic foundational work issues than others, not to prioritize or even any way be perceived as devaluing one profession over another. That's not my intent. Steph or Chris, feel free to jump on that one if you wish. And the last one is on the PMPRB. When do you think it is reasonable to expect a decision or guidance based on the government's agenda and competing timelines? John, if I knew that, I would be wrong because they haven't made any decision other than indecision. Right now, not indecision, they have made their decision. Their decision is that it will be implemented January 1st, 2022. So unless the government takes an alternative decision, this thing is being implemented January 1st, 2022. So I don't think it's a question of when do we think the government will make a decision. I think it's a question of will the government proactively take an alternative decision? Will they do something? Because doing nothing means it's implemented, and their timeline for doing that would be between now and January 1st. I think we're at time. Steph, Chris, any final thoughts?
It just, one thing to touch on, sort of looking at the calendar, we're looking at obviously an Ontario election next year, Quebec after that, Alberta after that. But I think we have to keep in mind that the results from this election and sort of the status quo that we're at right now, does that signal another election in 18 months or 2 years? I think we'll see how things unfold, obviously, in 2022. But looking at sort of long-term strategic planning for your organizations and sort of federal advocacy goals, I think there's a lot that could potentially change in the next 2 years. And so keeping that in mind. I don't know if my colleagues have anything to add to that.
I think it's a great final thought. Thanks, Steph. Thanks, Chris, and thanks everybody for joining.
Thanks, everyone.